Do you remember those cheap dinners every working class family ate in the 1970s? The ones that got us through more than just hunger? These meals showed up on the table night after night, made from little but filled with effort, care, and grit. What did they quietly give us that we didn't know we needed? Fish sticks, those crispy, golden-breaded delights, have been a fixture of American family dinners since the mid-20th century. While their origins date back to the early 1950s, when commercial frozen food production boomed, fish sticks quickly became a go-to for busy families. Made from white fish, typically cod or pollock, these little rectangular pieces of seafood are battered and deep-fried to perfection, making them as crunchy on the outside as they are tender on the inside. The classic pairing of fish sticks with tartar sauce elevates the meal. Tartar sauce, a tangy combination of mayonnaise, pickles, and lemon juice, adds a creamy contrast to the crispy fish. While the sauce has its roots in French cuisine, it became a beloved accompaniment to fish and chips, and later to fish sticks in the US. On the side, coleslaw, a salad made from finely shredded raw cabbage, carrots, and a tangy dressing, has been a popular addition to fish dishes for generations. Its crisp texture and slightly sweet flavor balance out the richness of the fish and tartar sauce. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles, and maple syrup. Dandelion and bacon grease salad is an example of how Depression-era and 20th century foraging can actually lead to some really innovative recipes. This is something that's rooted in rural Midwestern culture, and this salad makes use of whatever is available in the wilds that day. One of the most common things you would ever find in these wilds was dandelion greens. They grew wild in all kinds of environments, roadsides, fields, and yards, and they were a really prized thing for the people. Most folks believed it was a natural remedy for a lot of things because it was believed to help with things like indigestion, inflammation, and strengthening your immune system. In subsistence farming areas and coal country, it was very common for families to teach their kids how to forage dandelion greens. Remember how I told you about the way bacon grease is used in a lot of these dishes? Yeah, so after frying the bacon, a small amount of bacon grease would be preserved and it would be used to flavor any kind of bland or plain dish like beans and cornbread and give it a bit of a savory edge. The rendered fat was really helpful to people because it also meant they didn't exactly need that much oil. Goulash has become a favorite in many American households, a dish that combines the comfort of macaroni with the heartiness of ground beef. Despite the name, this American version of goulash is far different from its Hungarian roots, where the original dish was a rich stew made with beef, paprika, and vegetables. The American version, often made with macaroni, tomatoes, and ground beef, became popular during the mid-20th century, particularly in households looking for a quick, filling, and affordable dinner. The beauty of goulash lies in its simplicity. Ground beef is browned and simmered with onions, garlic, and seasonings, then mixed with cooked macaroni and canned tomatoes. This one-pot meal is easy to make and adaptable to whatever ingredients are on hand, whether it's adding a dash of hot sauce, swapping tomatoes for tomato paste, or stirring in some cheese for extra richness. Goulash quickly became a go-to comfort food for busy families, and it's still a staple today. It's the kind of dish you can throw together in no time, and it always feels like a warm hug in a bowl. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot, and here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. Mock-fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan-fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat, and a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. Steamed clams, a beloved dish especially along the coasts of New England, have been enjoyed for generations. This dish is a true celebration of seafood, as fresh clams are steamed until tender, absorbing all the flavors of the broth, often seasoned with garlic, herbs, and a splash of white wine or broth. Clams, which are bivalve mollusks, have been a staple in coastal cuisine for centuries, with Native Americans harvesting them long before European settlers arrived. The joy of eating steamed clams comes from their delicate texture and briny sweetness. The perfect clam should pop open easily when steamed, a sign that it's cooked just right. Paired with a slice of hearty brown bread and a dollop of butter, this dish becomes a complete, satisfying meal. The richness of the butter and the rustic flavor of the brown bread perfectly complement the clam's natural saltiness, creating a balanced, indulgent experience. Steamed clams with brown bread, because sometimes the best meals are the ones that come with their own dipping sauce. The dish reflects the simplicity of coastal living, proving that the freshest ingredients often make the most memorable meals. Whether served as an appetizer or a main course, steamed clams with brown bread and butter remain a timeless favorite, offering a taste of the sea with every bite. Baked turnips with herbs is an example of how even a simple and humble root vegetable can be turned into something that gets your kids at the table if you know what you're doing. Luckily, medieval-era cooks had a lot of room for trial and error, and they definitely learned a few things about working with turnips. While baking them was never as common as stewing or boiling them, it was extremely good. Households that had the privilege of a bake oven would abuse that luxury maliciously, in fact. That's just how nice it was. In households where that wasn't a thing, Tay turnips were typically wrapped in kale or cabbage leaves and then baked in ashes or at the edges of a hearth. This was a pretty rustic method, but it would help to soften the turnip, and it let the herbs introduce some much-needed flavor. Of course, you had to be very careful that what you were doing wasn't going to burn the turnips. Monasteries were most commonly known for preparing turnips, and they relied pretty much entirely on olive oil and butter. This resulting dish was something that was really earthy and savory, but the herbs helped when it came to the taste of turnips. For some, that taste can be really overwhelming. Rice and raisins were a really humble dish. When I talk about the psychological factor when it comes to eating, I'm referring to dishes like this. Rice on its own is perfectly edible, and it's something that people have eaten plain with nothing else for centuries. But eventually, that got old, didn't it? And even in the toughest of times, people needed a good snack, a sweet treat, something for the soul, a lot like how we do now. Their way of doing this on a budget? Take advantage of what Mother Nature's growing for you and throw in some raisins, which were really lovely because they were something that was abundant. You could either forage it, you could buy small boxes in bulk, and these were still relatively affordable, or government commodity drives and distributions would drop a few in your basket. The simplest iteration of this dish is just rice and raisins boiled in water, salt, and a pot. But if you want to take it a bit further, you can also mix in some milk, sugar, and butter, and elevate this dish into something that's a lot closer to a kind of rice-based custard or pudding. Kind of like kheer from Southeast Asian cultures if you've ever had it. Before plant-based eating became trendy, hearty vegetarian dishes like this one were a practical necessity. Creamy wild rice and mushroom casserole was a staple in Midwestern and Northern kitchens, especially during the colder months. Packed with earthy flavors and a rich, velvety texture, it was a comforting dish that felt just as satisfying as any meat-based meal. Wild rice, despite its name, isn't actually rice. It's a highly nutritious aquatic grain native to North America. Indigenous tribes harvested it for centuries, and by the mid-20th century, it had found its way into everyday cooking. Though slightly more expensive than white rice, its nutty flavor and chewy texture made it worth the price. Combined with mushrooms, one of the most affordable and widely available vegetables, this dish was both economical and deeply flavorful. A creamy sauce, often made with milk, butter, and a touch of sherry, tied everything together, creating a casserole that was rich yet wholesome. As convenience foods surged in popularity, canned cream of anything soup replaced homemade sauces, and wild rice was increasingly swapped for cheaper, quicker-cooking grains. Over time, this once-loved casserole became a relic of an era when scratch cooking was the norm. Scalloped ham and potatoes, a classic dish that brings together two of the most beloved comfort foods, tender ham and creamy, cheesy potatoes. This casserole has been a staple at family gatherings and Sunday dinners for generations, proving that simple ingredients can create something extraordinary. The dish's origins can be traced back to the mid-19th century, where scalloped potatoes, sliced potatoes baked in a rich, creamy sauce, became a popular side. The addition of ham likely came later, as cooks sought to stretch their budget by incorporating leftover meats. The result was a filling, satisfying dish that combined the savory goodness of ham with the comforting texture of potatoes. Scalloped ham and potatoes became even more popular in the 20th century when convenience foods like canned soups and processed cheese made their way into American kitchens. The creamy sauce, often made from a blend of milk, butter, and cheese, is what binds the layers of ham and potatoes, creating a hearty casserole that's easy to make but feels like a special meal. Scalloped ham and potatoes is the ultimate use-it-all dish, because who doesn't love a meal where everything gets smothered in cheese? It's a dish that's perfect for feeding a crowd and always leaves everyone asking for seconds. For generations, baked cod was a dependable, no-fuss dinner, particularly in coastal and New England households. Light, flaky, and mild in flavor, cod was one of the most affordable fish available, making it a practical choice for families looking to put a nutritious meal on the table without overspending. Topped with a crisp breadcrumb and herb crust, this dish was both simple and satisfying, proof that great cooking didn't need to be complicated. Cod's popularity was tied to its abundance. Throughout much of the 20th century, fresh or frozen cod was readily available at grocery stores and fish markets, and it didn't require elaborate preparation. A coating of breadcrumbs, butter, and fresh herbs locked in moisture while creating a crunchy, golden brown topping. Baked rather than fried, this dish had a lighter texture, making it a favorite among those who wanted something hearty without being heavy. So why did it disappear? Overfishing led to shortages, making cod more expensive, and as frozen fish sticks and pre-breaded fillies flooded supermarkets, many home cooks stopped preparing fish from scratch. The word mazlin actually ends up coming from mestillon in Old French, which means to mix, and that's exactly what mazlin bread is. If you wanted an idea of what a medieval mixed loaf would look like, then look no further. It was very common to see this in England, France, and the Low Countries, especially between 1000 to 1500 years. Mazlin was one of the most common kinds of bread for a specific reason, and this is actually because the climate was decently different in medieval times. Wheat was something that was born in more humid climates, so it struggled in northern and upland areas. Rye was a lot more reliable, on the other hand. It was known for also producing a darker bread that would keep you full for longer. People would get whatever wheat they had, mix it with rye, and get this loaf that was dense from rye but fluffy and soft from the wheat. It was a very interesting kind of loaf, really, and while we have several mixed grain breads in today's time, this was one of the easiest ways to spice up your daily routine back then. Garlic and leek broth was something that small-town dwellers would eat a lot. They were both reliable crops, and if that wasn't possible, they were both quite affordable. They were essential plants in almost every kitchen in most European countries. This broth in particular was valued in most communities because of its restorative properties. You ever had a broth or a soup that really just makes you feel 10 years younger again? Yeah, it was that kind of thing. Broth itself was really simple. Leeks could be sliced and cleaned, and then they would be crushed. And both of these would simmer in water, a light vegetable stock, and the broth could pretty much be flavored with salt. It could also be packed into pots and taken as a portable dish. Fresh or dried herbs like parsley, marjoram, and thyme were wonderful little additions to this dish. This isn't a dish that's unique to Europe either. It's a recipe that's seen in Chinese medieval cookbooks, Byzantine recipes, and many traditional recipes from Islamic countries. One of the next inventive things people came up with during really hard times was potato peel soup. This is about as bare bones as it sounds because it's really just seasoned water that's been made into a makeshift broth with potato peels in there. Despite this, let me tell you a little about why this is a pretty good dish. It's because it keeps you full for an incredible amount of time. Have you ever had oatmeal and felt incredibly full afterward? For like a surprisingly long amount of time? This is because oatmeal has a substantial amount of fiber in it, and potatoes are pretty much the same. Half their fiber content comes from the peel itself, actually. This is what makes potato peel soup such a good dish for when you don't really have any kind of money. It sustains you and really helps keep your appetite down, which is sad in retrospect because you have to be keeping your hunger down, but these days we have to do that pretty often. It helps to have dishes that are really good with fiber because they have this nice effect of you wanting less food, and thus you have more money at the end of the day. Spanish rice with tomatoes and green peppers, a flavorful side dish that has graced American tables for decades. Despite its name, it's actually more of a Mexican-American creation, born out of the fusion of traditional Spanish and Mexican cooking. The rich, savory base comes from simmering rice in a seasoned tomato sauce, with green peppers adding a touch of sweetness and color. The origins of Spanish rice can be traced to the influence of the Spanish in Mexico during the colonial period. The use of rice as a staple ingredient spread throughout Latin America, evolving into countless variations. In the United States, especially during the mid-20th century, Spanish rice became a popular side dish to accompany everything from tacos to fried chicken. The addition of green peppers, onions, and garlic to the dish added layers of flavor that made it even more satisfying. Spanish rice with tomatoes and peppers is the side dish that's just as colorful as it is delicious. So much flavor, it almost steals the show. It's a versatile, easy-to-make dish that always pairs well with a variety of main courses. For years, cornbread stuffed pork tenderloin was a homecoming dinner favorite, combining the rich, juicy flavors of pork with the comforting, slightly sweet notes of cornbread dressing. It was the kind of meal that felt celebratory but was made with everyday ingredients. Pork tenderloin was an affordable cut, prized for its tenderness and quick cooking time. Cornbread, a staple in southern and midwestern kitchens, made the perfect stuffing, absorbing the juices from the meat while adding its signature crumbly texture. Sage and dried cranberries brought a hint of warmth and sweetness, making this dish a natural fit for fall and winter gatherings. Some versions included pecans for extra crunch, while others used sausage to double down on the savory depth. So why did this dish fade from dinner tables? As boneless, pre-seasoned pork cuts became common, elaborate stuffed roasts became less appealing to the average home cook. The extra steps of butterflying, filling, and tying up a tenderloin made it feel like a holiday dish rather than a weeknight option. But for those who appreciate the balance of savory pork and buttery cornbread, this is a recipe that deserves a second look, because some traditions are too good to leave behind. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well, because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala F. Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavoring, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. Corn dodgers weren't always the Super Bowl phenomena you know them to be today. Back in the day, they were actually one of the few ways where families could eat and still be full. Corn dodgers basically involve corn cakes that are either fried or baked and then served as a main dish. But when people had any kind of meat or potatoes, just anything at all that was bulkier and heavier to serve it with, they would almost always serve it as a side dish. Still, corn dodgers were essential to getting by the day back then, and they're just as important now. Making these at home is as easy as it gets as well, because once you have the mixture for a corn cake ready, which is a really simple process involving like 3 steps max, all you need to do is shape them into form and get to frying. These make for such a cheap and affordable midday snack, and they're the perfect thing to come back to from work. Best part? You can prepare meals and make enough corn cake batter and just freeze it, so you don't even have to deal with the entire process when you get back home tired from work. A dish that combines the simplicity of ground beef and rice with the vibrant crunch of bell peppers, stuffed bell peppers have been a staple in American kitchens for decades. This hearty meal has roots in both European and Mediterranean cuisines, where stuffed vegetables have been enjoyed for centuries. In the US, it became a popular choice for families during the 1950s, with ground beef as the primary filling. The dish is incredibly versatile. Ground beef is often seasoned with onions, garlic, and spices, then mixed with rice to create a filling that's packed into hollowed-out bell peppers. The peppers, typically red, green, or yellow, hold the filling and become tender when baked, infusing the entire dish with a sweet, smoky flavor. While some recipes call for tomato sauce or cheese to top the peppers, others leave them as is, letting the natural flavors shine through. This dish is perfect for using up leftovers or for a simple, budget-friendly dinner. Stuffed bell peppers are like a dinner with everything in one package, just like a meal wrapped up with a bow. For generations, lamb was a prized centerpiece of homecoming feasts and holiday gatherings. Its deep, rich flavor and fall-apart tenderness made it a dish reserved for special occasions, especially in families with European or Mediterranean roots. Slow roasting a lamb shoulder with garlic and fresh herbs was a time-honored tradition. Lamb was once far more common on American dinner tables than it is today. In the early 20th century, it was an affordable alternative to beef and pork, particularly in rural areas where small-scale farming was the norm. Shoulder cuts were especially budget-friendly, benefiting from long, slow cooking to break down tough fibers. Roasted low and slow with rosemary, thyme, and whole cloves of garlic, the meat absorbed deep, aromatic flavors while becoming melt-in-your-mouth tender. So why did it disappear from everyday meals? As industrial farming shifted American preferences toward beef and chicken, lamb fell out of favor. It became harder to find in grocery stores, and for many home cooks, its distinctive flavor was an acquired taste. Faster, more convenient proteins replaced slow-cooked roasts, and over time, this once popular dish faded into obscurity. Boiled bread dumplings were sometimes known as sinkers, mostly because they would just sit there as if they were sinking into the plate, but these were really as frugal as it would get. This was a dish that was made from old or stale bread, and all it took was fat, some eggs, or just an egg really, and bread, flour, and water. These dumplings were something you would see a lot in immigrant neighborhoods, especially the ones that were always around factories, industrial sites, construction sites, just heavy-duty neighborhoods where most laborers would live to cut down on commute. They started off as a way of just using stale bread so that it wouldn't go to waste. But the question is, how do you actually make dumplings at home like that? Well, the bread was just soaked in hot water, and the flour was mixed in so that it would hold. If an egg wasn't there, it would be a bit looser of a dish, but the dough would still be thickened, and the mixture would just need to be formed into rough balls. The dumplings were then simmered and boiled, and there you had it. Each immigrant community had its own different variation of this too. German, Eastern European, and Czech communities all had their own definition of what making this should be like. Salmon patties, a classic dish found in many American homes, offer a tasty and affordable way to enjoy fish. Often made with canned salmon, these patties are mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings, then fried to golden perfection. The dish has roots in the 1940s, when canned fish became a popular pantry staple due to its long shelf life and affordability during tough economic times. Despite being simple, salmon patties are packed with protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and heart-healthy nutrients, making them both a tasty and nutritious choice. The secret to a great salmon patty lies in its texture, crispy on the outside, yet tender and flaky on the inside. Often paired with a generous helping of creamed peas, this dish takes on a comforting, homey feel. Creamed peas are made by cooking fresh or frozen peas in a creamy sauce, sometimes enhanced with butter, milk, and a touch of seasoning. The creamy, mild flavor of the peas balances the richness of the salmon patties, creating a perfectly matched duo. Salmon patties with creamed peas are the kind of comfort food that makes you think, "Why did I ever stop eating this?" It's an easy, satisfying meal that stood the test of time, offering comfort with every bite. Slow cooking was once an art form, and few dishes showcased it better than a well-braised short rib. This was a meal that required patience. Tough cuts of beef transformed into fork-tender perfection after hours of simmering in a rich, aromatic sauce. Deeply savory, fall-off-the-bone ribs were the reward for anyone willing to wait. Short ribs were once considered a budget cut, prized not for their tenderness, but for their flavor when cooked properly. Unlike steaks or roasts, these ribs needed time and care to break down the tough connective tissue. The solution was a slow braise in red wine, broth, and aromatic vegetables. Over several hours, the flavors deepened, and the meat absorbed every note of the wine's richness, creating a dish that was as elegant as it was hearty. For much of the 20th century, this was a homecoming dinner classic, perfect for cold evenings and special occasions. But as cooking habits changed, so did the popularity of slow-braised dishes. People wanted quick meals, not ones that took all afternoon. Short ribs also became more expensive as demand for premium beef cuts soared, making them less common in everyday kitchens. Hot cornbread is a historically significant variation of cornbread. Why? It's because it was so common in many disadvantaged communities in the South. Poor Black communities and even white communities in towns and rural outskirts from the 19th to the 20th century would try to get through the week just by lasting on this. As far as keeping it low-key is concerned, this minimalistic dish is definitely the way to go, and cornmeal, boiling water, and salt is all you need. It doesn't need eggs, milk, or wheat flour, it doesn't need any kind of oven, and it also doesn't really feel like a meal either. A small scoop of cornmeal was enough to make a lot of patties, yeah, but you needed a decent amount of sides to make sure it was actually a fulfilling dish, like beans, greens, and potatoes would help a lot. Also, in Black Southern communities, hot water cornbread was one of their core recipes. A real pillar of the community, and each different variation of cornbread was passed down from generation to generation, usually just by observation, word of mouth, or having someone drill the lesson into your head. Almond milk porridge was a very common dish throughout the medieval times. It was something two groups of people would use very regularly. One, it's something you would always see in a wealthy person's pantry. Almond milk was seen as a luxurious kind of milk, and the cost of almonds was high. Second, it was common amongst Catholic citizens who were fasting on Fridays. Animal-related products would often be banned during fasts, but almond milk was just plant-based. It was a lot more typical to see it in monastic kitchens and in cities rather than anywhere outside of that. The porridge would be made by simmering the grains until they were soft and thick, and then almond milk would be added in and stirred so that the dish could become smoother and more rich. People back then would grind blanched almonds into pastes and then steep them in water. They'd strain the mixture through a cloth to produce the liquid, and the leftover pulp was something people would use in cakes and other desserts or for more porridge later on. It was a pretty comforting and refreshing dish. Milk soup was exactly this kind of dish. People really just wanted anything sweet during the Depression, mostly because, unlike carbohydrates and protein, it would actually change their mood. Something that was considered relatively impossible during the Depression, hence the name. Milk soup is also exactly what it sounds like. This isn't some kind of fancy dish where you add a lot of sherry wine or lots of rich foraged aromatics and herbs to the milk to make some tonic. This is literally just milk and flour. If you're particularly lucky on the day you make it, you might even add some butter. This would thicken the soup too, and well, make it more soup-like. Still, this was something that people kinda just gulped down because they had nothing else. I don't think it would particularly work well today for us because it's so hard to get anyone today to drink milk regularly unless it's in a frappe. So imagine serving milk soup. It's just not something that does a lot for you, you know? Still, assuming you have nothing else and absolutely no options left to try either, then it might make for an okay filler snack. What do you think? Is milk soup something you'd give an honest shot to? There was a time when meatloaf was a household tradition. Made from simple, inexpensive ingredients, it was a staple of weeknight dinners and homecoming feasts alike. But what made this version special was the glaze, a perfectly balanced mix of ketchup and brown sugar that caramelized into a sticky, flavorful coating as it baked. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins, and by mixing it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, home cooks could stretch a single pound to feed an entire family. Some variations included oats or crushed crackers, while others relied on Worcestershire sauce and mustard for added depth. But the secret weapon was always the glaze, a blend of sweet and tangy flavors that sealed in moisture and gave the loaf its signature glossy finish. So why did this dish start disappearing from dinner tables? As dietary trends shifted, meatloaf's reputation took a hit. Low-carb diets, leaner meat choices, and a move away from home-cooked comfort foods made it less popular. Pre-made frozen meatloaves also contributed, offering convenience at the cost of homemade flavor. Rabbit stew is pretty self-explanatory. It's, well, rabbit stew, you know? I'm just kidding. It was a lot different from the stews we might be used to seeing today or even 50 to 60 years ago. Hunting wild game such as rabbits was how people lived off of the land, and making these stews would ensure enough food to last the day and give everyone 2 or 3 square meals. What people would do is add as many herbs, aromatics, and vegetables as they could. They took a very different approach to cooking. Some of these spices, like cumin or black pepper powder, may not necessarily have gone the best with rabbit stew. They were still added for any perceived medicinal benefits, though, like digestion and gut health. Back then, people were so used to eating whatever was available or whatever would keep them full longer. If it would taste good, that would be even better, but something tasting good was never a priority. Hunting rabbits was something everyone, from kids to adults, would be involved in, and villages and communities would set out traps for miles to capture as much game as they could. Bread pudding with water sauce is about as simplistic as it comes. This is a dish that people didn't even really put any thought into. It was just a way for them to repurpose resources that were about to spoil and go to waste. This is really something you never want happening in the Depression because it was a sign that you were just not handling your pantry properly. Back then, people religiously followed a mindset of not wasting anything, even the grease and drippings from bacon, and you'll find a dish or two made out of that later on in this video too. Back to bread pudding with water sauce. So, you might have heard of bread pudding before, but what really is water sauce? I mean, it sounds like a bastardized version of sparkling water when you first hear it. It's actually just a modest attempt at making a thickened sauce out of just water, because most of the time people were not working with any kind of legitimate thickener or enough ingredients to make a proper sauce, so they had to settle for whatever they could come up with to make stale bread more refreshing. The bread pudding in question is essentially just stale, almost moldy bread soaked in sweetened water, and most of the time, the sweetening was with things like maple syrup. Even this is something people began to tap out of maple trees whenever they could because they couldn't spend the extra cents. Still, we have a lot more leverage nowadays, so you can probably actually make a decent bread pudding-based sauce dish with enough ingredients and guidance, but the next time you really need to finish some bread, you know what to make. When it comes to simple yet elegant meals, few combinations can match the light, flaky fish paired with the richness of lemon butter and the crispness of asparagus. Baked cod or halibut are perfect choices for this dish. Both are mild white fish that take well to a variety of seasonings, but it's the lemon butter that steals the show, bringing a burst of freshness that complements the delicate flavors of the fish. Cod and halibut have been long favorites in American kitchens, especially along the coastlines where they're abundant. Cod, with its firm texture, has been a staple in New England since the colonial era, while halibut is prized for its mild taste and large fillets. Both fish are low in fat but high in protein, making them an excellent choice for a healthy, satisfying dinner. Asparagus, often served alongside fish in this dish, is packed with vitamins and minerals, making it a nutritious addition. The key to a great asparagus side is cooking it just enough to maintain its crunch, while the lemon butter ties everything together in perfect harmony. A meal like this is a reminder that simple ingredients can create something extraordinary. Side dishes were once as thoughtfully prepared as the main course, and few were as simple yet elegant as a well-roasted carrot medley. Coated in honey, butter, and a hint of cinnamon, this dish was a staple at homecoming dinners, adding a touch of natural sweetness to balance out heavier meats and casseroles. Carrots were a practical choice for home cooks. They were cheap, easy to store, and available year-round, making them a kitchen essential. Roasting them brought out their natural sugars, and when paired with honey and warm spices, they became more than just a side dish. They were a highlight. Some versions used maple syrup instead, while others incorporated fresh herbs for a more savory twist. No matter the variation, the result was always a vibrant, glossy medley of tender carrots with a flavor profile that felt both nostalgic and indulgent. As processed vegetable sides and microwave steamed bags took over grocery store shelves, many home cooks stopped roasting vegetables altogether. Instead of taking the time to caramelize their natural flavors, people opted for pre-cut and pre-cooked options. Side dishes were once as thoughtfully prepared as the main course, and few were as simple yet elegant as a well-roasted carrot medley. Coated in honey, butter, and a hint of cinnamon, this dish was a staple at homecoming dinners, adding a touch of natural sweetness to balance out heavier meats and casseroles. Carrots were a practical choice for home cooks. They were cheap, easy to store, and available year-round, making them a kitchen essential. Roasting them brought out their natural sugars, and when paired with honey and warm spices, they became more than just a side dish. They were a highlight. Some versions used maple syrup instead, while others incorporated fresh herbs for a more savory twist. No matter the variation, the result was always a vibrant, glossy medley of tender carrots with a flavor profile that felt both nostalgic and indulgent. As processed vegetable sides and microwave steamed bags took over grocery store shelves, many home cooks stopped roasting vegetables altogether. Instead of taking the time to caramelize their natural flavors, People opted for pre-cut and pre-cooked options. Just the way corned beef hash was revolutionary because it made beef so available, canned tomato sauce was the same. Macaroni and tomatoes is an example of how people received the introduction of canned food with a lot of excitement. I mean, if you were told that you didn't have to spend half an hour in the kitchen beating up sticky tomatoes to make a paste and you could just go buy one for a few cents, wouldn't you be happy? Plus, it was an excuse to get out of the house. At least we have grocery store escapes in common. We also have macaroni and tomatoes in common, mostly because just like bacon ends and boiled greens, this is a dish that would hold up perfectly in today's culinary climate. Boiled elbow macaroni would be mixed with canned or fresh tomatoes or tomato paste, finished with just a bit of grease, lard, or butter, and then seasoned with salt and pepper. While the flavor of the dish was mostly the same, what was really interesting was the way its texture could change so wildly. This could be made like a stew, thick and velvety, or it could be made like a soup, creamy and slightly thin, but overall thick. People definitely took advantage of that and changed it up as much as they could to keep things fresh. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change, but nowadays, even that's like half your rent. A true testament to how simple ingredients can create something extraordinary, corn pudding casserole with a sweet custard base is a comforting classic. With its rich custardy texture and subtle sweetness, it's a comforting side that's just as at home at Thanksgiving as it is at a Sunday family dinner. Corn pudding has roots in early American cooking, influenced by Native American corn-based dishes like succotash. However, the casserole version, often made with a combination of cornmeal, eggs, milk, and sugar, emerged in the 19th century as settlers began adapting recipes to make use of what was readily available. The sweet custard base, made with eggs and cream or milk, gives the dish its signature smooth, slightly sweet texture that contrasts perfectly with the corn kernels. It's also a dish that evolved with convenience in mind. As canned creamed corn became widely available in the mid-20th century, many home cooks began using it to simplify preparation without sacrificing flavor. Corn pudding is a crowd pleaser, and its versatility allows for adjustments. Some might add a touch of cheese, while others prefer to keep it pure. For decades, this dish was the definition of hearty, home-cooked comfort food. A cross between a hamburger and a meatloaf, Salisbury steak offered all the savory satisfaction of a beefy main course, without the expense of premium cuts. Smothered in a rich mushroom and onion gravy, it was often served alongside mashed potatoes, soaking up every last drop of its flavorful sauce. The origins of this dish date back to the late 19th century when Dr. James Salisbury, a physician, promoted chopped beef as a health food. But it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it became a household favorite, especially during the post-war years when ground beef was an affordable, versatile staple. Mixing the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings helped stretch a family's grocery budget, making it a go-to recipe for filling, cost-effective meals. The cooking process was simple yet rewarding. The beef patties were seared to lock in flavor, then simmered slowly in a rich, savory gravy made from beef broth, onions, and mushrooms. The rise of frozen TV dinners turned Salisbury steak into a mass-produced meal, often losing the homemade taste that made it special. Boiled onion dinners are essentially exactly what they sound like. The idea here was to take an entire onion, use some salt and pepper, and, well, just get to it. This isn't really something that I think could apply at all today to our world or lifestyle anymore, but if you feel differently or better yet, have different experiences surrounding this, please mention them in the comments. I'm so curious about what this even feels like afterward. This is very telling of the kind of lifestyles people were having before the Depression ended. It was something that was really common in early American frontier households, especially the ones from the 18th and 19th centuries. Onions back then used to be equivalent to treasure because of how well they were stored, and they also were seen as a wonderful flavoring ingredient. Then, in Appalachia and different parts of the South, onions were such a common crop that they became a regular at dinners. It became standard practice to boil whole onions and have them together with some cornbread, of course. Any meat would help, but it was rarely given. Interestingly enough, from what I've read, the onion is supposed to get sweeter. But that's also a little strange because you just don't associate onions with that kind of flavor, right? Onion tarts were naturally one of the go-to meals for people, given how important onions themselves were in times like these. But one has to ask, what really is an onion tart? A typical medieval tart would basically start with a coarse flour crust. This would be made from the typical rye, barley, and maslin mixes we've seen so far, and that's how the pastry was made. This would be a vessel for the filling, which would be made out of parboiled onions and butter. These softened onions would be mixed with herbs and then enriched more with eggs or fresh cheese, whichever was available, or both, if you were doing well. This mixture would then go into the shell of the tart, and it would then be baked until you would get a lightly brown surface. In southern Europe and the regions that are now France and Germany, this dish was the predecessor of dishes like onion pies in modern times. This was a pretty herbal-tasting dish that carried the flavor of onions over almost perfectly, and it was something people would rely on when they wanted an open-faced, savory treat. Once a humble staple of farmhouse kitchens, savory sweet onion pie was a testament to how simple ingredients could be transformed into something extraordinary. With its flaky crust, velvety custard, and layers of slow caramelized onions, this pie was both comforting and surprisingly elegant, a dish that fit just as well on a holiday table as it did at a casual family dinner. Onions have long been one of the most affordable and widely available vegetables, making them a practical choice for home cooks looking to stretch their budget. When cooked low and slow, their sharp bite mellowed into a deep, natural sweetness. Combined with eggs, cream, and sometimes a sprinkle of cheese, they created a rich, quiche-like filling that was both satisfying and economical. Some versions leaned into the southern tradition of sweet onions, using Vidalias to enhance the dish's natural sugars. So, why did this once popular pie disappear? As savory tarts and quiches became more associated with upscale brunches rather than home-cooked meals, hearty onion-based dishes faded from everyday menus. The rise of pre-made frozen quiches also contributed, making from-scratch versions less common. So, despite the way we got this from Hungarian immigrants, the American version of goulash is actually a lot simpler than the traditional recipe. This one has beef and pork in it simmered with different kinds of vegetables and paprika. But American goulash was something that evolved so that it could suit the circumstances people were in back then. Immigrants from Eastern Europe were introducing the Hungarian version, but by the middle of the 20th century, if you asked somebody what goulash was, they'd just tell you it was browned ground beef with tomatoes, pasta, and simple seasonings. Once all of that's together and it's simmered, you get your goulash. People would eat it with leftover meat scraps, which really added a decent amount of flavor to the dish if you had enough. What they would do is stretch out their food and conserve ingredients like bacon grease, butter, and meat scraps for dishes like this, which actually looked like you spent a lot of time on a well-thought-out cooking session. Something that was really rare if we're looking at the kind of food the working class was eating during the 20th century. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Few dishes capture the culinary experimentation of the late 20th century quite like this one. With its bold combination of prunes, olives, capers, and white wine, chicken marbella was a breakout star of the 1980s dinner party scene. It was elegant, unexpected, and a perfect example of how sweet and savory flavors could work together in harmony. The recipe originated from the Silver Palette Cookbook, a landmark 1982 publication that introduced home cooks to sophisticated yet approachable recipes. What set this dish apart was its unique balance: briny olives and capers cut through the sweetness of prunes, while white wine and vinegar created a tangy, aromatic sauce. Chicken, an affordable and versatile protein, absorbed the flavors beautifully as it marinated overnight before baking. Despite its popularity, chicken marbella eventually faded from home kitchens. As the 1990s brought a shift toward faster, simpler meals, dishes requiring overnight marination and complex flavor profiles became less common. The rise of international cuisine also introduced new, trendy flavors that overshadowed this once-beloved classic. Peanut butter noodles might seem like a blasphemy of several degrees when you first hear about it, but keep an open mind, an empty stomach, and very, very short patience, and you'll see where people are coming from. Peanut butter noodles were essentially the go-to for most people when they were really trying to stretch things out, and they wouldn't be out in grocery marts buying packets of egg noodles or spaghetti. They would be making it at home using wheat and flour or whatever substitutes they could find. It was actually a very admirable trait back then. People were really against buying anything that could be made at home. But just noodles don't really do the trick at all, does it? It doesn't help ease that hunger. I mean, it might fill you up, but there's also the psychological aspect of eating, right? You want to feel fulfilled after a meal, and when you don't, it's pretty natural for people to keep eating. When that wasn't an option, meals like this became godsends because they were simple ways of adding flavor, any kind of flavor to dishes that were otherwise so bland, boring, and dry on their own, but had to be eaten out of necessity, because what else were you going to do? A perfectly roasted chicken was once the ultimate symbol of home cooking. Before rotisserie chickens lined supermarket shelves, families gathered around the table for a golden, crispy-skinned bird fresh from the oven. Coated in a flavorful crust of herbs and breadcrumbs, this dish turned an everyday staple into something worthy of a special occasion. Whole chickens were a budget-friendly choice, stretching across multiple meals. Unlike pre-cut pieces, a whole bird could be roasted, carved, and repurposed into soups or sandwiches, making it a practical investment. The breadcrumb and herb crust added texture and flavor, sealing in juices while creating a beautifully crisp exterior. Traditional blends featured rosemary, thyme, and parsley, but regional variations introduced garlic, lemon zest, or even a hint of paprika for extra depth. Pre-seasoned chicken breasts, boneless cuts, and store-bought rotisserie birds made the slow-roasted whole chicken tradition feel unnecessary. For many, the extra step of trussing, seasoning, and roasting no longer fit into busy weeknight schedules. Yet, for those who remember the aroma of herbs mingling with sizzling chicken fat in a warm oven, there's no substitute. We're going to start our list off with cabbage and potato hash. Honestly, it doesn't get more economical than this either, so it's a fantastic place to start. Let me tell you a little something about cabbages and potatoes before we begin dissecting this dish. So, back in the days before modern refrigeration became such a nationally accepted miracle, people actually used to worry a lot about the seasonal nature of ingredients, fruits, and vegetables. Cabbage and potatoes were arguably the sole exception to this because they can be grown and cooked pretty much throughout the entire season. Now, this was also a dish that took barely any oil or lard, and also didn't really require any kind of cooking utensils, skills, or experience. It's one of the most ideal dinners because potatoes and cabbage are always available for dirt cheap in markets, and you can make an infinite amount of combinations through them. Though some people really don't like their cabbage, something about the texture. Which side of the boat do you find yourself leaning towards? Are cabbage and potato hash something you'd try if your wallet was in bad enough shape? Or would you have a taste anyway just to see? Cabbage and corned beef hash have a really practical history in American food culture. It's something that came about as a humble wartime dish whose purpose was to turn any leftovers into something that could really get people seated at the table, but it also just shows you how resourceful people were. Corned beef hash was pretty recent considering it made its name during World War I and World War II, right when it was introduced into the United States. The canned version, like the Hormel's cans you've probably seen lining up grocery store marts, is actually something that was the lifeblood of many people back then. Corned beef hash was an insane step forward because it meant that rationed, affordable, preserved meat was now more accessible than ever. And that only meant that things like cabbage, which were year-round vegetables, were that much more in demand as side items, ingredients, and toppings. Corned beef hash was a way for people to have cheap calories and protein, and it makes sense too, because the thing was designed for maximum efficiency, so it could be used by soldiers during wartime. If you actually want to look at a dish that was made out of nothing but pure creativity, tenacity, and cleverness, and a dish that also got forgotten because it reminded people of horrible times, then you need only look at water pie. This is a dish that shows you the amount of resourcefulness people had to apply in their daily lives, but it's also a dish that's tied to and associated strictly with extreme poverty. You'll find out why once I tell you how it's made. But first, some history. This was a dish that people either remembered really fondly because of its ability to just give you a sweet dish with such little effort, or for how it was a reminder of how bad things were. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to the cooking process, shall we? Because it's an interesting one. You just take a basic pie crust, which was usually something people were making in their homes with shortening and lard, and then you take some water. The filling was a mixture of the tiniest amounts of flour, butter, and sugar. Then, finally, some water would be added. There were no eggs, milk, vanilla extract, cocoa powder, essences, anything like that. This exact filling, as it was, would go into the oven and come out a fully baked pie. Some people threw in different kinds of things in this too to make it work, like cinnamon, nutmeg, and peanut butter. Some people even threw in onions, meat scraps, and grease to make it a savory pie. But either way, I'm excited to try this. Are you? Smoked fish pie is a dish that combines comfort with bold, smoky flavor. Popular in the United Kingdom and other coastal regions, this hearty pie features a blend of tender smoked fish, often cod, haddock, or salmon, cooked in a creamy sauce, all tucked beneath a rich mashed potato crust. This combination of smokiness and creaminess is balanced perfectly by the smooth texture of mashed potatoes, creating a dish that feels both indulgent and satisfying. The origins of smoked fish pie trace back to the tradition of using smoked fish as a preservation method, particularly in maritime cultures. Smoking fish was an effective way to keep it fresh for longer periods, and the technique made its way into home cooking as a flavorful method for adding depth to dishes. The mashed potato crust, a beloved comfort food component, serves as the ultimate topping, golden and crispy on top, soft and fluffy on the inside. It's a dish that's rich in history and flavor, offering a unique twist on traditional pies. Smoked fish pie with mashed potato crust brings together the best of both worlds, seafood and comfort, making it a dish that's sure to please the whole family. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. If these 70s dinners reminded you of what really fed us, drop a comment, like the video, and subscribe so we keep remembering what mattered most.